Welcome to Stribling's New York. I am your host, Rob Taub, on WOR AM Radio, 710 on your digital dial, and iHeartMedia Company. Stribling's New York is a show about business, culture, and people. We have a wide range of guests from authors, producers, actors, artists, writers, restaurateurs, as well as people from the world of real estate who will help you buy, sell, rent a home or apartment. Stribling has been in business for over 35 years and has always been one of New York's premier luxury brokerage firms with over 300 real estate professionals, all possessing a unique perspective and skill set, providing the utmost in service and experience. Today's show is really great. We have some wonderful guests. We have Howard J. Smith, author of Beethoven in Love, Jessica Lappin, who's the president of the Alliance for Downtown in New York City, Amir Kamnapur, who is an interior decorator, and Michael Riedel, who is a columnist for the New York Post, and he has written a wonderful book called Razzle Dazzle. And our first guest, who is waiting for me on the phone, is Howard J. Smith, the author of Beethoven in Love, and it's a really fantastic book, and he has told me that Beethoven is our first rock star. Welcome, Howard.
Thank you, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here on the show.
So tell me about the book. I know nothing. The only opus I know is the Opus 1 wine, which I drink when I can afford it, which is seldom, especially for what they're paying me here at WOR. Do you hear that, WOR? So
I'm sure you get along fine with Beethoven, who was also very fond of drinking wine every night with his friends. But the book is basically, it's a novel, first of all, and it talks about his life. It's a good read, but we begin with the fact that Beethoven is a rock star. In his era, he was as disruptive an influence, and if you can go back and picture the 50s with the Chordettes singing Mr. Sandman in 5-part harmony, and along comes Jimi Hendrix blasting out Purple Haze, that was Beethoven as a young man. He was a very disruptive influence to music as was known at the time, and he was full of passion and energy, something that was lacking in some degree from the prior music that was around, people like Haydn and a little bit of Mozart, where they were about structure and form and doing things the right way. Beethoven broke the rules, just as many of the early rock stars did. And just like a rock star, he was very attracted to and attractive for the women of his era, particularly the aristocratic women. And even this evening, you led in with the intro from the Moonlight Sonata. The Moonlight Sonata was written for one of the women who is thought to be what we know as the immortal beloved. Later in his life, in his early 40s, he wrote a letter, one of the most passionate love letters, and it's kind of appropriate with doing this right before Valentine's Day, that he failed to put her name on the front of the letter. And for almost 200 years, people have wondered, who is the immortal beloved? Who is the woman he was writing this letter to, which is frequently quoted in fragments.
It's like everybody's trying to figure out who, at one point, who Layla was written for. So was it the Layla of its day?
Exactly. Very much so. And he was this great romantic figure who was full of passion and fire. And again, like a lot of our famous rock stars, as he got into his late 20s, he started having a lot of trouble in that he began very early in his life to go deaf. It didn't happen all at once. It was very slow, very progressive. But could you imagine, a 27, 20-year-old young man who's at the top of his game as a pianist and as a beginning composer, and all of a sudden he starts to lose his hearing.
Give us an idea of the span of Beethoven's life. How old was he when he died, and when was his peak as an artist?
Right. He was born in 1770. He died in 1827. He was 56 years old. And his greatest piece, the Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy that we all know, was written when he was 54 years old. He was totally deaf at that point. He began going deaf, as I said, in his late 20s, which would have been around 1800 or so. And it got progressively worse. He even contemplated suicide. In addition to the Immortal Beloved letter, which was only found after he died, There was also another document called the Heiligenstadt Testament, the name of a village where he wrote it. It was actually kind of a suicide letter that he wrote when he was 32, because at that point he realized he was going to be deaf and not able to function as a musician unless he fought back. And he did everything he could in those early years, his 20s and 30s, to write the famous music that we know now, the Fifth Symphony, the da-da-da, and so forth, his great piano concertos, all of his heroic music. He wrote principally in his 30s as kind of a response to the fact he was going deaf. He even wrote the Heroic, or Eroica Symphony as we know it, when he was about 33 years old. Originally, it was dedicated to Napoleon. He was living in Vienna at the time, and the real music scene at the time was happening in Paris, and he thought he loved the image of Napoleon, who he was in those days, as a representative of liberty, equality, fraternity, and justice. And he was considering moving to Paris. And he wrote the Third Symphony, initially titled it Bonaparte, hoping that maybe he could present it in Paris when he got there, and he sought out opportunity to try to do that. He never did leave Vienna, though. And as he was writing it, he had finished the final draft. News comes to him that Napoleon had declared himself emperor. Beethoven was absolutely furious that this man who represented the hopes of the people was suddenly becoming the aristocracy and royalty, and he scratched out the name Bonaparte on the manuscript. That piece of paper still exists today in a museum in Germany. And he changed it to the Heroic, or Eroica Symphony as we know it today. But he was very much in his 30s. That was his prime. And he hid his deafness until he was getting into his late 30s, early 40s, when it became apparent that he really could not hear. He could not conduct orchestras. He struggled to hear conversations. He did what a lot of us do who have hearing problems, which is kind of to nod, yes, yes, yes. And
my father used to do that a lot. I have a quick interjection here. It's interesting to me is I know more about popular music, the Great American Songbook, and I've always been fascinated. Cole Porter wrote most of his songs, which was all about happiness and partying and life is grand, so on and so forth, when he was hopelessly crippled after a horrible riding accident, as his legs were crushed, and he was in constant pain and agony. I don't know how entirely analogous is, but he also led, so which leads to my kind of tangential question here. I'm channeling my mother now, is what kind of living did Beethoven make? How did he do? Was it because somebody like Cole Porter lived like a pasha and did quite well, and now, I mean, if you're a rock star and you're Bruce Springsteen, you're worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Did Beethoven ever struggle?
He struggled his whole life. Again, not having any form of electronic sales or media in that era, everything was local. So he was essentially a working stiff most of his life. He did get some support and something of an annuity of sorts from some friends of his who were of the aristocracy, and that was designed to keep him in Vienna. As long as you stayed within the Habsburg Empire, we'll give you this money. But it was not connected to any one particular piece. It was not connected to any one assignment. He did not work for anyone in particular. It was simply to help support him in his work. But other than that, he wrote, for example, 600 pieces, half of which, unbelievably, were the music for Scottish and Irish folk songs that a publisher friend of his who was German but had moved to England would send him to write. He needed the money.
Where are these tunes now? Are they completely gone? Are they available? Have they ever been recorded?
They're floating around in the blogosphere, so to speak, of its time. Very little of that is around that we can find easily, but it is out there, and if you search, you can track it down.
Now, another question about your book. Unfortunately, I don't have the copy, but I've read a lot of the works, most of the work of E.L. Doctorow. So when you said this is a novel, is it a Doctorow-style historical novel?
It's more literary in tone. It is very well, heavily researched. Spent 2 years just doing the research alone on this, because you realize we know a lot about Beethoven. There's a lot of information. We have 6 huge volumes of letters to and from him. We have diaries he wrote. We have things called conversation books. When he was deaf, people would write questions to him on a book paper, and he would answer verbally. So there's a lot of biographies done by his contemporaries, his friends that he'd known his whole life. So there's a lot of information, but I approached it basically. This novel takes place in a metaphorical sense in the moment of his death. And his death is one of those stories you can't make up. He's 56 years old. He's lying in bed in a coma for 2 days. There's a snowstorm and a thunderstorm going on outside his apartment. And his friends leave the apartment, save one, to go make funeral arrangements. A bolt of lightning strikes his building right outside the window of his room. He suddenly sits upright, his eyes open, he clenches his fist, or so we're told, shakes it at the heavens, and then he's gone.
that you can't make that up.
Yeah, no, you can't.
This is a great. It's a great story.
The epilogue and the prologue of the novel, and the story takes place in that moment as he is traveling towards what he believes is paradise or Elysium, the fog, and in this realm, this otherworldly realm, as he's trying to deal with all the issues and problems of his life, he encounters the one man who preceded him death, who's also known by one name, which is Napoleon.
Well, that's fascinating. I hate to cut you short. I love this interview where we have to wrap up because we have another guest, but I urge everybody to go buy this book by Howard J. Smith, Beethoven in Love, Opus 139. It sounds fascinating, and I'm going to read it myself. So thanks for joining us, and I hope we can have you back soon.
Love to be back again.
Thanks a lot, Howard.